The little black girl signaled the biker while dozens of engines formed a blockade across the mountain bridge. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, let's dive into today's story. Have you ever been in a situation where everything seemed hopeless, and then someone appeared out of nowhere to save you? Well, this is one of those stories. It's about a little girl, a biker, and a bridge that would become the scene of a dramatic showdown. It was an ordinary evening at the edge of a small town nestled in the mountains. The wind carried the faint scent of pine and earth, and the distant rumble of motorcycles echoed through the valley. On this night, everything would change. A little black girl, no older than 10, ran frantically down the winding mountain road. Her shoes were missing, and her hair, once neatly braided, now hung in wild tangles behind her. Tears streaked down her face as she cried out for help. "They took my brother," she screamed, her voice breaking with desperation. She pointed to the distant figure of a silver SUV speeding away, tires screeching as it disappeared around a bend. The girl was alone, terrified, and with nowhere to turn. She knew she had to act fast, but she also knew she couldn't do it alone. At the foot of the mountain, a group of bikers had gathered around a fire. They had just finished a long ride and were relaxing, swapping stories about the road. But when they heard the girl's cry, everything changed. One of them, a seasoned rider with years of experience under his belt, recognized the urgency in her voice. His name was Jack, but everyone called him Hawk. He had seen more than his fair share of trouble, but this was different. There was something about the girl's eyes that made him pause. She wasn't just another person in need of help. She was someone who had been pushed to the edge. "Stay here," he told his crew, his voice calm but firm. "I'll be back." He revved his motorcycle and sped off, the roar of the engine a signal to the others that something serious was happening. As Hawk followed the girl down the mountain road, he saw the silver SUV in the distance, its headlights cutting through the darkness. The girl's story made sense now. Someone had taken her brother, and they were headed to who knew where. Hawk's mind raced. He had made a promise long ago to protect the people who mattered, and this little girl was no exception. He wasn't going to let her down. But as he approached the mountain bridge, a new wave of tension gripped him. This was it. The only way out for the kidnappers was through the bridge. Hawk radioed ahead to his crew, instructing them to set up a blockade. Within minutes, the sound of dozens of motorcycles filled the air, growing louder and louder as the riders formed a wall across the narrow bridge. The bikers lined up in perfect formation, blocking every possible exit. It was a move that would send a clear message: no one was getting away tonight. As Hawk reached the bridge, he saw the silver SUV inching closer. His heart pounded in his chest as he steered his bike toward the front of the blockade. It was time to make a stand, to show the kidnappers they had underestimated the power of family. This wasn't just a fight for a little girl's brother, it was a fight for justice. Ignoring the rush of engines behind him, Hawk's eyes locked onto the silver SUV. The sound of his bike's roar blended with the rising noise of the other riders behind him, now forming a perfect blockade across the mountain bridge. His grip tightened on the handlebars, his heart pounding in time with the beat of the approaching confrontation. The kidnapper's car was closing in fast, and there was no way out now. Hawk's mind raced. He had been in dangerous situations before, but this felt different. The girl, Aisha, had pleaded for help, and the bikers, his family, had responded. No one was walking away from this without a fight. Hawk could see the panic in the driver's eyes as the silver SUV tried to speed up, realizing that their escape route was being cut off. The driver slammed on the brakes, trying to swerve, but the road was narrow, and the motorcycles surrounding him were unrelenting. Hawk quickly radioed his crew. "No one moves until I say so. Hold the line." His voice was steady, but his stomach churned. This wasn't just about blocking a car. It was about protecting a life. A little girl's life. The engine of his Harley was still roaring beneath him, and the vibrations ran up his spine as he leaned closer to the front of the blockade. The SUV was now about 20 yards away. Hawk's crew was scattered, the heavy rumble of their bikes creating an impenetrable wall of steel and leather. They had trained for this kind of situation, acting quickly, decisively, and without hesitation. But Hawk knew that no matter how many of them there were, they couldn't take any chances. They had to make sure Maya, the girl they had promised to protect, was safe. The silver SUV swerved again, but it was too late. Hawk didn't even blink as he moved his bike into position, blocking the driver's path. The moment the car came to a stop, Hawk pulled off his helmet and stepped toward the vehicle. His boots clacked against the bridge's surface, the sound sharp and heavy against the tense silence that hung in the air. The kidnapper, an older man with a weathered face and a cold expression, glared at him through the windshield. He didn't speak. He didn't have to. Hawk could see the fear in his eyes, the realization that he had nowhere to run. "Get out of the car," Hawk said, his voice low but commanding. The man hesitated, then slowly unbuckled his seatbelt and opened the door. As he stepped out, Hawk's crew surrounded him, their eyes cold and unwavering. They didn't need to say a word. The man knew he was trapped. Hawk took a step forward, his posture solid and unyielding. "I don't want any trouble. I just want to make sure Maya's okay," the man stammered. Hawk's eyes narrowed. "You're not in a position to make demands. Get on your knees." The man's face paled as he slowly dropped to his knees, his hands raised in a feeble gesture of surrender. Hawk reached for his phone and dialed the number of the social worker who had called him hours earlier. "She's safe," he said simply. "We've got her stepfather." The voice on the other end of the line let out a relieved sigh. "Thank you. Thank you so much, Hawk." Hawk didn't respond right away. His gaze was still fixed on the man kneeling before him. "This isn't over," Hawk muttered, almost to himself. The man's eyes darted nervously between the bikers. "Please, I didn't hurt her. She was just a little confused. I was only trying to get her home." "You don't get to explain yourself," Hawk said, his voice hardening. "You're not taking her anywhere. Not tonight. Not ever." The man started to shake, but Hawk's focus never wavered. The bikers began to close in around him, their presence overwhelming. He knew they had Maya, and as long as she was safe, nothing else mattered. Aisha was crying silently at the edge of the blockade, still in shock from the events that had unfolded. Hawk glanced back at her, his expression softening for a moment. She was watching the scene unfold, and her small hands were tightly clasped together, her knuckles white from the pressure. She looked like a deer caught in headlights. Hawk approached her slowly, his steps steady and reassuring. "He won't hurt you anymore," he said gently. "You're safe now." She nodded silently, her eyes never leaving the kneeling man. Hawk stood beside her for a moment, letting her process everything that had happened. The sounds of engines and chatter from his crew seemed distant now. All that mattered was the girl in front of him, and the promise he had made years ago to her father. Hawk turned back toward the kidnapper. "We're taking you to the authorities," he said. "And when they're done with you, you'll be in a place where you can't hurt anyone else." The man said nothing, his head hanging in defeat. As the bikers began to disperse, Hawk's mind started to drift. This wasn't over. Maya was safe, but the road ahead would be long. They had won this battle, but the war was far from finished. The scene on the mountain bridge remained tense as the bikers moved to secure the area, their engines still rumbling in the background. Hawk stood over the kneeling man, his gaze unflinching. His crew had already begun calling the authorities, but Hawk knew the situation was far from over. Maya was safe for now, but the deep-rooted danger that had brought her to this moment was still out there. As the man was cuffed and placed in one of the bike sidecars, Hawk turned to Aisha, who was still standing by, her small form trembling with a mixture of fear and relief. He approached her slowly, giving her space to breathe, but also offering a silent reassurance. "It's over," Hawk said softly, his voice calm. "He won't hurt you or anyone else again." Maya's younger sister, Leia, clung to Aisha's side, her wide eyes scanning the scene, still trying to understand what had just happened. Hawk's heart went out to them both. They had seen more than any child should. The situation had escalated quickly, but they were now safe, and that was what mattered. Aisha nodded but didn't speak. She was still processing the whirlwind of events that had unfolded in the last few hours. The kidnapping, the bikers' blockade, and the confrontation with her stepfather had all been too much for her to fully comprehend. Hawk, understanding her need for space, glanced at his crew, signaling them to prepare for the next step. "We need to move out," Hawk called to the bikers. "Let's get these kids somewhere safe. The cops will handle the rest." As the bikers began to fire up their engines and prepare to leave, Hawk pulled out his phone, dialing the social worker who had initially contacted him. He spoke briefly, confirming that Maya and her sister would be taken into protective custody and placed with a foster family for now. "We've done our part," Hawk said, his voice steady. He wasn't about to let his guard down, not after what had happened. There were still questions that needed answering. Why had her stepfather done this? What had happened to her mother? And most importantly, who else was involved in the shady dealings that had led to this chaos? Hawk couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning. The ride back to town was uneventful, though the tension never fully left Hawk's shoulders. The weight of the promise he had made to Tyrone all those years ago hung heavy on him. He had sworn to protect Maya, and now he had done just that. But the unsettling truth was that the darkness that had brought them here wasn't gone. It was only temporarily suppressed. Hawk couldn't ignore the nagging thought that something, was still watching, waiting to strike. When they arrived at the town's outskirts, Hawk stopped at a small diner. The bikers dismounted, and the crew began to disperse, heading inside to grab a bite to eat before heading back to their respective homes. Hawk leaned against his bike, taking a deep breath. The quiet night felt almost surreal after the chaos they had just experienced. The air was cool, and the sound of crickets filled the silence. But Hawk couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to happen. The door of the diner opened, and Aisha stepped out, her eyes meeting Hawk's. "Thank you," she said, her voice soft but sincere. "You and your crew, you really saved us." Hawk gave a small nod, tipping his head slightly. "We're family," he replied simply. "And family doesn't leave anyone behind." As they stood there, a quiet understanding passed between them. Hawk could see the relief in Aisha's eyes, but there was still fear lingering there, a fear that wouldn't easily fade. The truth of what had happened to her family, and the darkness that had tried to tear them apart, would take time to process. But for now, Maya and her sister were safe. Hawk would make sure of that. He looked back at the diner, where his crew was gathering around a table, laughing and talking. For all the noise they made, it felt strangely peaceful in this moment. In a world full of chaos, moments like these, moments of true protection and loyalty, were what kept people going. Hawk's phone buzzed, and he glanced at the screen. It was a text from his lawyer, Derek Bonds. "I've got some information about your stepfather's case. There are more people involved in this than we thought." Hawk's jaw clenched. He knew it. He wasn't surprised. The night's events had only scratched the surface. "We'll handle it," Hawk texted back. "We always do." As he put his phone away and joined the crew inside the diner, he realized that this wasn't just about protecting a little girl anymore. This was about something bigger, something that would take every bit of strength and resolve they had. And he was ready. The sound of his brother's laughter echoed around him, but Hawk's thoughts were already focused on what lay ahead. He had made a promise to his fallen friend, Tyrone, and he intended to keep it. Maya and her sister would be safe, no matter what it took. The ride back to town was quieter than Hawk had expected. The wind in his face as he cruised through the mountainous roads helped clear his mind, but the weight of what had just happened still hung over him. The moment when he had faced down the kidnapper, the tension in the air, and the overwhelming sense of responsibility had left him with little room for rest. The bikers, his family, were now dispersing to their homes, the job done, but Hawk knew that the true fight was still ahead. He had promised Tyrone, Maya's father, that he would protect his little girl. He had kept that promise, but there were still too many unanswered questions. The girl's stepfather, the man who had caused so much harm, wasn't the only one involved. Hawk knew that. There was a deeper web of corruption and crime, and it wasn't just about Maya. It was about something much larger. As the last of the bikes rolled off the main road, Hawk stopped in front of a small cafe on the outskirts of town. It was late, and the streets were mostly empty, save for a few cars passing by. The bright lights of the cafe flickered in the distance, inviting him to take a moment to breathe. He parked his bike and walked inside. The diner was nearly empty, save for a couple sitting at the far table. Hawk removed his helmet and hung it on the seat next to him, running a hand through his graying hair. He motioned for the waitress and ordered a cup of coffee. It wasn't much, but it was enough to settle his thoughts. As he waited, his phone buzzed in his pocket. Hawk pulled it out, recognizing the number immediately. It was Derek Bonds, his trusted lawyer. "What's the word?" Hawk answered, his voice steady. "It's worse than we thought, Hawk." Derek's voice came through, filled with urgency. I've been digging into the stepfather's records, and it looks like he's been involved in more than just domestic violence. This goes deep, man. There's a network of people he's connected to, some of them high up in law enforcement, and others, well, let's just say they're not the kind of people you want to mess with. Hawk's stomach tightened. He had known it wouldn't be easy, but this was different. What do you need from me? Hawk asked, already knowing the answer. We need to act fast. The authorities are involved, but this is a matter of pulling strings. I've got a few contacts I'm reaching out to, but you need to keep your head down. There's a target on your back now. Hawk leaned back in his chair, looking out the window at the night sky. I didn't sign up for this, he muttered to himself. But we're already in too deep. Derek paused, his voice softening. I know, but we're in this together. Just keep your people safe, and we'll handle the rest. Hawk felt the weight of the conversation settle on him. The promise he had made to Tyrone was bigger than he had realized. It wasn't just about protecting one girl. It was about protecting everything she represented. She was a symbol now, a beacon for everything that was wrong with the system. But Hawk wasn't going to back down. He couldn't. He was more than just a biker. He was a protector. That's why they rode. That's why he had made a promise to a dying man. And now it was time to see it through. All right, Hawk said, standing up and walking toward the door. I'll get the crew together. Let's finish this. The line went quiet for a moment before Derek responded. Stay safe, Hawk. We'll be in touch. Hawk hung up the phone and walked outside, the cool air hitting his face as he strapped his helmet back on. He knew there was no turning back now. He fired up his bike and revved the engine, the familiar sound filling the empty streets. He couldn't waste time. Maya and her sister had been saved for now, but the fight was far from over. Hawk was ready. The road ahead would be long, and it would test everything he had. But he would not back down. The promise he had made was one that couldn't be broken, no matter what. As he rode off into the night, the stars above seemed to echo his resolve. There was no turning back. It was time to face the storm. And with the thunder wolves at his back, Hawk was ready to bring the fight to them. The next morning, the world seemed quiet again, but Hawk knew better. There was still a storm brewing on the horizon. The sun was barely peeking over the mountains as he rode back into town, the cold wind biting at his face, reminding him that things weren't over. He had made a promise to Tyrone, and the weight of that promise had only gotten heavier. The bikers had dispersed after the tense standoff with the kidnapper. The mission was accomplished, Maya was safe, but Hawk knew that wasn't the end of it. Not by a long shot. As he pulled into the parking lot of the small garage where the crew usually met, Hawk was already thinking about what came next. He parked his bike next to the others and was greeted by a few of his brothers, each of them silently acknowledging the importance of the situation. Where's the kid? Bear, the massive man with a thick beard, asked as he wiped his hands on a rag. Hawk nodded toward the back. Still at the safe house. Social services has been contacted. They're sorting things out, but I don't trust them. Not yet. Got your back, Bear said, cracking his knuckles. We'll make sure they're all right. Hawk appreciated the support, but he knew this was about more than just keeping the girls safe. It's bigger than this, Hawk said, his voice low. That stepdad, there's something off about him. I don't buy the whole, I was just trying to help story. And we need to find out why he was really involved in this. There are connections. People. This thing is deeper than we thought. His crew listened carefully, their eyes sharp, understanding that Hawk wasn't just talking about one man or one family anymore. They had entered a world where promises were tested, and loyalty had to go beyond just showing up. You want us to start digging? Phantom, the quiet and calculating member, asked. Yeah, Hawk replied. Start with his background. The guy was a cop. Check his records, see if we can find any links to shady business. There's no way this was a one-time thing. I'm betting he's been working with some bad people. I'll get on it, Phantom said, already pulling out his phone. As Hawk turned to head inside, he caught a glimpse of Aisha, standing near the door of the safe house with Maya and Leia by her side. They looked calmer than they had the night before, but Hawk could still see the fear in their eyes, the kind that didn't just go away overnight. He walked over to them, his boots crunching on the gravel. How are they doing? He asked Aisha, his voice softer now. Better, Aisha said, but Hawk could tell she was holding back. But it's not over for them. Maya's scared. Leia's still in shock. He nodded. I know, but you're doing good. You're keeping them safe. And that's all that matters right now. Aisha's eyes flickered with gratitude, but the weight of everything still hung heavy between them. She was trying to hold it together for her sisters, but Hawk could tell it was taking everything she had. "Thank you," she whispered, the words catching in her throat. Hawk gave her a small smile. "You don't need to thank me. We're family, and family takes care of each other." Just as the conversation seemed to reach a moment of peace, Hawk's phone buzzed in his pocket. He pulled it out and saw the name that sent a chill down his spine, Derek Bonds. "Hawk, we've got a problem." Derek's voice came through the line. "That's stepdad, Patrick Donovan. He's connected to a group of powerful people. I'm talking about more than just a few corrupt cops. This goes deeper. I've been digging, and what I'm finding, it's bad, real bad." Hawk's blood ran cold as Derek continued. "They're looking for revenge, Hawk, and they're not going to stop until they get it. They know about you. They know about the bikers. This is just the beginning." Hawk took a deep breath, trying to calm the surge of adrenaline rushing through him. "How bad is it?" he asked, his voice low and controlled. "It's bad," Derek replied. "I've been trying to track the money, the connections, but it's all tangled up in a web of businesses, fake charities, and political influence. I don't have all the pieces yet, but I'm close." "How close?" Hawk pressed. "Give me a few more hours. But whatever you do, stay out of sight. They know you're involved now, and they won't hesitate to come after you, or anyone you care about." Hawk hung up the phone and turned to his crew, his mind racing. He knew what this meant. They were in deep, and the danger wasn't just from the lawless individuals they had already confronted. This was a whole other level. "We're not out of the woods yet," Hawk said, his voice steady, but his eyes hard. "The stepdad? He's just the tip of the iceberg. This thing goes deeper, and if we're going to protect Maya, her sister, and everyone else caught in this mess, we need to go on the offensive." Bear's eyes narrowed. "What's the plan?" "We dig, we watch, and we prepare for war," Hawk said, his voice full of resolve. "We're not letting these people get away with what they've done. We'll find them before they find us." His crew nodded in agreement, their faces set with determination. Hawk could see the fire in their eyes. They were ready, and whatever came next, they would face it together, like family. But Hawk knew this was just the beginning of something far more dangerous, and he wasn't sure they were ready for what was coming next. The weight of Derek's warning hung heavy in the air as Hawk ended the call. He stood there for a moment, his gaze distant, processing what he had just heard. The situation had shifted from a rescue mission to something far darker. The more Derek dug, the more they uncovered about the deep, dangerous web that had ensnared not only Maya's family, but countless others. The bikers weren't just up against rogue individuals anymore. They were up against a network of people who had the power to destroy lives without a second thought. Hawk knew the stakes had just gotten a lot higher. They weren't fighting for one little girl anymore. They were fighting for justice, for the truth that had been buried under years of corruption. Hawk's thoughts were interrupted by the rumble of approaching bikes. His crew was back, their engines cutting through the still morning air. They pulled into the lot, dismounting one by one, their faces grim. "We ready?" Bear asked, his massive frame towering over the others. Hawk nodded, steeling himself for the battle ahead. "We've got a lot of work to do," he said, his voice low and steady. "Derek's finding more, but it's going to take all of us to get to the bottom of this. We can't let them think they can keep getting away with it." The crew exchanged looks, understanding the gravity of the situation. They had been through plenty together, but this was different. They weren't just taking down criminals. They were exposing a system built on lies, and that kind of fight was dangerous. "What's the plan?" Phantom, the sharp-eyed tech expert, asked. Hawk pulled out his phone, showing the crew the information Derek had sent. "We start by following the money. Derek's looking into the businesses connected to Donovan. The goal is to find the money trail and trace it back to the bigger players." "And what do we do if the authorities try to stop us?" Shadow asked, his voice carrying a hint of concern. Hawk's eyes narrowed. "We stay smart. We stay quiet. We do this by the book. If we have to, we'll call in favors, but we're not going in guns blazing. Not yet." "Got it," Bear said. "Let's start by finding out who's behind this. I'll keep an eye on Donovan's movements." "Phantom, I need you to dig deeper," Hawk continued. "Look into any possible connections between him and the people he's been working with. We know he's been part of something bigger. We need to expose it." The crew immediately got to work, each member heading off to their respective tasks. Hawk watched them go, feeling the familiar sense of camaraderie that had always kept them going through the toughest of times. They were more than just bikers. They were a family. As Hawk prepared to leave, Aisha walked up to him, her eyes filled with gratitude, but also something else, worry. "What now?" she asked quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. "You're safe," Hawk reassured her, putting a hand on her shoulder. "Maya and Leia are safe. We're going to make sure this doesn't happen again. But it's not going to be easy. There's a lot of darkness surrounding this whole situation, and it's going to take all of us to fight it." Aisha nodded, her eyes filled with both fear and hope. "I just want this to be over. For them to be safe. For Maya to be able to have a normal life." Hawk's heart clenched. He had promised to protect her, and he wasn't going to break that promise. "We'll make sure that happens," he said firmly. "But we can't do it alone. We need to stay vigilant, and we need to keep going until we expose the truth." As Hawk mounted his bike and revved the engine, his mind raced with the next steps. This fight was far from over. It was just beginning. And as the crew prepared for what lay ahead, Hawk knew one thing for sure. He wasn't going to stop until every last one of those responsible for this nightmare was brought to justice. He took off down the road, the rumble of the engine beneath him a constant reminder of the battle he was about to face. The wind whipped past him, the horizon stretching out before him. The stakes had been raised, and there was no turning back now. The bikers were in this fight together, and they would see it through to the end. The sun had barely risen, casting a faint orange glow over the town as Hawk's bike cut through the quiet streets. The night's events felt like a blur, but the reality of what they were facing had never been clearer. His phone buzzed in his pocket, pulling him from his thoughts. It was Derek. "Hawk, I've got news." Derek's voice came through, tense. "The people we're up against, they're connected to a lot more than just Donovan. These are some serious players. We've got a lead on a meeting, a big one, happening tomorrow. It could give us the breakthrough we need." Hawk's grip on the handlebars tightened. His heart raced at the thought. "Where's it happening?" he asked. "In the industrial district, near the old warehouses. It's a risky play, but if we can get in undetected, we might finally get the answers we need." "We'll be there," Hawk replied, already making plans in his head. "But we need to move fast. No mistakes." The line went quiet for a moment before Derek spoke again. "I've also got eyes on Donovan's associates. They're starting to get nervous. If we make the wrong move, they'll scatter. But if we play it right, this could be our chance." Hawk nodded to himself, the weight of responsibility heavy on his chest. They couldn't afford to fail now, not when they were this close. Not when Maya and her sister's safety depended on it. He hung up the phone and revved the engine, making his way to the garage where the crew had gathered. When he pulled in, his brothers were already there, waiting. Bear leaned against his bike, his arms crossed. "What's the plan?" Hawk gave a quick rundown, his voice steady but urgent. "Derek's got intel on a meeting tomorrow. We get in, get what we need, and get out. No heroics. We can't afford to tip them off." "Sounds risky," Phantom said, his voice low. "But it's the only shot we've got." "Exactly," Hawk replied. "We have to stay smart. We don't just want to take them down. We need to expose everything. The whole network." His eyes scanned the faces of his crew. They were ready. They had been through worse, and this time, they would see it through. "We leave tonight," Hawk said, setting the tone. "We're not waiting until tomorrow. We get into position early, and we make sure they don't see us coming." The crew nodded, each of them moving with purpose. They knew what was at stake. This wasn't just a mission, it was personal. As Hawk suited up and prepared to ride, he caught a glimpse of Aisha standing at the door of the safe house. She hadn't said much since the previous night, but Hawk could see the worry in her eyes. "How's Maya?" he asked softly, walking over to her. Aisha smiled faintly. "She's better. She's asleep now, finally. Leia's still on edge, but we're getting through it." Hawk gave a small nod, his mind racing with the weight of everything they had to do. "We're going to finish this," he said, his voice firm. "You and the girls stay here. We'll make sure they're safe. I trust you." Aisha replied, her voice quiet but resolute. Hawk didn't say anything more, just gave her a reassuring look before turning back to his bike. The night air was cool as they hit the road, the sound of engines roaring in unison. The town slowly faded into the distance, replaced by the winding roads of the countryside. Hawk's thoughts were focused on the mission, on the faces of the people who had caused so much pain. The more he thought about it, the more it became clear. They weren't just dealing with criminals. They were dealing with a system of corruption that ran deep. The bikers rode in formation, their headlights cutting through the darkness. Every turn, every mile, brought them closer to the industrial district. Hawk's focus never wavered, but his mind kept drifting back to Aisha and the girls. He couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched, that they were part of something much bigger than he had ever anticipated. As they neared the meeting spot, Hawk motioned for the crew to slow down. They had to be cautious now. They couldn't risk being spotted too soon. "We stick to the plan," Hawk said, his voice low. "We wait until they show up, and then we move. No mistakes." The crew nodded in agreement, their faces grim. This was it, the moment of truth. As they hid their bikes in a nearby alley, Hawk scanned the area. The industrial district was quiet, the kind of place where no one would think to look for something out of the ordinary. But Hawk had learned long ago that quiet places could be the most dangerous. They waited in silence, the only sound the distant hum of traffic. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours, but finally, they saw movement. The meeting was about to begin. Hawk's pulse quickened. This was their chance. He looked at his crew, giving them a silent signal. It was time to move. They slipped through the shadows, moving swiftly toward the warehouse where the meeting was set to take place. Hawk's thoughts raced as he approached the building. This was bigger than just Maya's family. This was a fight for justice, a fight for truth, and it was a fight that they couldn't afford to lose. The door to the warehouse creaked open as Hawk and his crew slipped inside, ready for whatever came next. The storm was about to break, and Hawk was ready to face it head-on. The warehouse was dark, the faint sound of voices drifting from inside. Hawk motioned for the crew to stop, his body language tense, his mind running through every possible scenario. The plan was simple: get in, gather information, and get out. But the stakes were high. They couldn't afford any slip-ups. As Hawk and his crew crept closer to the entrance, the smell of oil and rust filled the air. The building was quiet, but Hawk knew that would change soon. They had been waiting for hours, but now, the time had come. The lights inside flickered, and the door to the warehouse opened slightly. Hawk held up his hand, signaling for everyone to stay still. He could hear muffled voices now, the unmistakable sound of a meeting in progress. He motioned for Bear and Phantom to take the left side, while Shadow, Colossus, and the others would cover the right. Hawk's heart was pounding, but he kept his breathing steady. They had to remain calm. The door creaked again as a figure stepped out. It was a man in a suit, his face shadowed by the brim of his hat. Hawk's instincts kicked in. He recognized him immediately. It was one of the men from the Stepfather's network. The figure was moving quickly, unaware of the biker's presence. Hawk moved silently, his boots barely making a sound as he crept toward the door. He had to know what they were talking about. What deal were they making? Who else was involved? As Hawk peered through the crack in the door, he saw more figures inside. 3 men sitting around a table, papers and files scattered in front of them. The low murmur of their voices was just audible enough for Hawk to catch snippets of the conversation. "We need to move fast," one of the men said, his voice gravelly. "Donovan's slipping. If we don't act now, everything we've built is going to crumble." "We can't afford that," another man replied. "We've worked too long to have it all go to waste." "What about the kid? The one they brought in?" Hawk felt his stomach tighten. They were talking about Maya. "The kid. She's the key," the first man said. "If we control her, we control the situation. We need to make sure they don't get any more leverage. If they find out about the connections," he trailed off, the implication hanging in the air. Hawk's blood ran cold. This wasn't just about Maya's safety anymore. It was about something far bigger. He had known they were dealing with dangerous people, but this was a full-blown operation, with lives hanging in the balance. He turned to Phantom, who had slipped in beside him. "We need that information," Hawk whispered, his voice low. "Now." Phantom nodded and slipped into the shadows, his eyes scanning the room. Hawk knew he could trust him. The rest of the crew was in position, ready to act at a moment's notice. He didn't want to make a move until they had what they needed. The tension in the air was palpable. Hawk could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on him. The men inside were talking about Maya, his promise to protect her, and he wouldn't let them get away with it. As the conversation continued, Hawk's mind raced. He thought about Aisha and her sisters, about the danger they were in, and about the fight they had ahead. But more than anything, he thought about the moment when they would finally expose the truth. The truth about the corruption, about the people who had been pulling the strings. It was only a matter of time before they brought it all down. Phantom returned, his face grim. He had the information they needed. Hawk took a deep breath, the weight of their mission settling heavily on his shoulders. It was time to make their move. They couldn't wait any longer. As the crew prepared to enter, Hawk's thoughts were already on the next step. They had the intel. Now, it was about getting out clean, about ensuring that the people behind this would never have the chance to hurt anyone else again. With a final glance at the crew, Hawk gave the signal. They moved swiftly, entering the warehouse, their boots echoing in the silence. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. They were ready for whatever came next. This fight had only just begun, but Hawk wasn't backing down. Not now. Not ever. As Hawk and his crew stormed into the warehouse, the tension in the air was thick with anticipation. Every step was calculated, each move made with precision. The sound of their boots on the cold concrete floor echoed through the cavernous space, amplifying the feeling that they were about to disrupt something much larger than they had initially anticipated. Hawk's eyes scanned the room, his senses on high alert. He could feel the presence of the men inside, the ones responsible for orchestrating the mess they had found themselves in. This wasn't just a simple rescue operation anymore, it was war. His crew moved in quickly, taking their positions. Bear and Colossus flanked the sides, while Phantom and Shadow stayed low, blending into the shadows. Hawk led the way, his eyes locked on the men at the far end of the warehouse. They were gathered around a table, papers scattered in front of them, talking in hushed tones. Hawk knew they weren't expecting an intrusion, at least, not this soon. He motioned to Phantom, who nodded and slipped behind a stack of crates to get a better angle. Hawk took a deep breath and stepped forward. The men hadn't noticed them yet, too caught up in their conversation. Hawk could hear the words now, clearer than ever. "The kid's still the key," one of the men said, his voice low and gritty. "We can't let them find out about the rest. We still need her under control." Hawk's stomach turned. They were still talking about Maya. The nerve of these men, treating her like a pawn in their game. "If we make one wrong move, we're done," another voice added, sharper this time. Hawk recognized it. This was one of the men from the night of the standoff. He was the one who had seemed the most confident, but there was fear in his voice now. Fear of being exposed. Hawk wasn't sure what was worse, the fact that they were still planning to use Maya, or the realization that they had so many connections. These men weren't just criminals. They were part of a larger network that had its hands in everything, from law enforcement to high-powered businesses. "We need to get rid of the evidence," the first man said. "The bikers, Donovan screw up, the girl. We clean it up, and no one will be the wiser." Hawk's blood ran cold. They were planning something big, something that could wipe everything clean, make all their crimes disappear. The stakes had just been raised to an entirely new level. They weren't just trying to control Maya. They were trying to erase all traces of their operation. Hawk had to act fast. He motioned for his crew to move in, but just as he was about to make his move, one of the men turned and caught a glimpse of Hawk's crew in the shadows. "What the hell is this?" The man's voice boomed through the warehouse, sending a shockwave of panic through the group. Hawk didn't hesitate. "Get down," he shouted to his crew. The first shots rang out almost immediately. Hawk dove for cover behind a pillar, his heart pounding in his chest. The sound of gunfire echoed in the warehouse as the crew quickly returned fire, their movements calculated and swift. Hawk's mind raced. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. They weren't ready for a full-on confrontation, not yet. But now that they were in it, there was no turning back. As the crew returned fire, Hawk's thoughts focused on one thing, Maya. They had to stop these men. They couldn't let them get away with their plans. With every passing second, Hawk felt the weight of the promise he had made to her father, Tyrone. He had sworn to protect her, and now, more than ever, it was clear that the fight was far from over. "Push forward," Bear shouted, his voice booming over the chaos. Hawk peeked from behind the pillar, scanning the room. The men were scrambling, trying to find cover, but Hawk could see that their operation was already falling apart. They weren't as organized as they thought. They were desperate. "Take them out," Hawk barked, his voice steady despite the chaos. The bikers moved in unison, their weapons aimed at the remaining targets. As Hawk advanced, he saw Phantom and Shadow clear the back corner, pushing the men toward the front of the warehouse. The tables had turned, and the men who had been pulling the strings were now trapped. Hawk's mind was focused solely on one thing: stopping these men from escaping. As they cornered the last group of criminals, Hawk stepped forward, his eyes cold with resolve. The man in charge, the one who had been directing the operation, looked up, his face pale as he realized he was out of options. "You're finished," Hawk said, his voice low but steady. The man didn't speak, his chest rising and falling rapidly with fear. Hawk could see the fear in his eyes, but there was no sympathy from him. These men had caused too much pain, destroyed too many lives. They didn't deserve mercy. The sound of sirens filled the air as the authorities arrived, but Hawk didn't wait around. He motioned for his crew to head out, signaling that their job was done. As the bikers made their way back to their bikes, Hawk's thoughts shifted back to Maya. She was safe, for now. But Hawk knew this was just the beginning. The truth was out there, and they weren't finished exposing it. There was still a long road ahead, and Hawk wasn't going to stop until every last one of these men was brought to justice. The morning after the chaos at the warehouse, Hawk stood outside the garage, his gaze fixed on the horizon as the sun began to rise. The air was crisp, and the first rays of light seemed to wash away the darkness of the night before. The crew had done their part, and the authorities had taken over the scene, but Hawk knew that the battle was far from over. The tension in the air was still thick, and the weight of everything they had uncovered hung heavily on him. They had exposed the tip of a dangerous iceberg, but there was still so much more to uncover. As the bikers gathered around, their faces grim but resolute, Hawk felt a sense of urgency building inside him. The men they had taken down were just the beginning, but the network they had been part of stretched much farther than any of them had imagined. "We've got a lot to process," Hawk said, his voice steady but filled with determination. "But this isn't over. We've taken out a small piece of this operation, but there's more behind it. And we're not stopping until we get to the heart of it." Bear, ever the loyal ally, nodded. "We've made a lot of noise. They know we're on their trail now." Hawk's eyes hardened. "That's the idea. Let them think they can run, but we're not letting up. We find the rest of them and shut this down for good." "What's our next move?" Phantom asked, his eyes sharp, already calculating. Hawk took a deep breath. "We start by taking out the middlemen. The people connected to Donovan. He's the key, but we need to hit the others who are still hiding in the shadows. We need to start making moves on their businesses, their networks, and hit them where it hurts." Colossus, who had been quiet until now, spoke up. "We'll need intel. We can't just rush in blindly." Hawk turned to him, his eyes steady. "I know. Phantom, I need you to keep digging. See if you can find any connections to people in the higher-ups, politicians, business owners, anyone who might be covering for these guys. We need names. We need leverage." Phantom nodded. "I'll get to work. I've got a few sources I can reach out to." As the crew prepared for their next steps, Hawk's mind couldn't help but drift back to Aisha. He hadn't seen her since the night before, and he knew the toll that all of this was taking on her. She was strong, but the weight of everything, Maya's kidnapping, the danger that still loomed, was wearing on her. He needed to check in with her. Hawk walked into the safe house, where Aisha was sitting at the kitchen table, her hands wrapped around a cup of coffee. Her eyes were tired, but there was a sense of resolve in them that mirrored his own. "How are they doing?" Hawk asked as he sat down across from her. Aisha sighed, looking over at Maya, who was playing with Leia in the living room. "Maya's been quiet. Leia's scared, but she's starting to open up. I don't know how to explain all of this to them. They're just kids." Hawk leaned forward, his expression softening. "I know, but they're safe now, and that's because of you." Aisha looked down at her hands, her fingers tracing the rim of her cup. "I didn't expect any of this. I just wanted to protect them." Hawk placed a hand on hers, his grip reassuring. "You're doing more than that. You're keeping them safe, and we're going to make sure nothing happens to them again." Aisha nodded, her eyes meeting his. "I'm scared, Hawk. This isn't just some random act. These people, they'll stop at nothing." Hawk's jaw clenched. "That's why we have to keep pushing. They're trying to cover their tracks, but we won't let them. We'll find everyone involved, and we'll make sure they pay for what they've done." There was a moment of silence between them, the weight of their conversation settling in. Then Aisha spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "What if they come after us? After the girls?" Hawk stood, his resolve hardening. "They won't. Not as long as we're here." He looked toward the door where the rest of the crew was waiting. "We've got a job to do, and we're not backing down." As Hawk turned to leave, Aisha called out to him, her voice full of emotion. Please, be careful. Hawk gave her a reassuring smile. I will. We all will. The crew was ready. They knew what was at stake. The road ahead was going to be dangerous, but Hawk had made a promise. He would keep it, no matter what it took. As he stepped out into the cool morning air, the weight of everything ahead felt like a heavy cloak around him. But he wasn't alone. They were a team, and they would face whatever came next together. The time for talking was over. It was time to act. They had a mission, and Hawk wasn't about to let it slip through his fingers. He turned to his crew, his voice firm. Let's finish this. The sound of engines roaring to life filled the air as they prepared to take the fight to the people who had caused so much pain. Hawk knew this wasn't going to be easy, but he wasn't afraid. The time had come to take down the network once and for all, and nothing was going to stop him. The moment Hawk and his crew arrived at the industrial district, the air was thick with the weight of what was to come. The quiet of the early morning had quickly turned into a tense atmosphere. The sound of distant vehicles and the occasional screech of tires against asphalt were the only things breaking the silence. Hawk could feel the tension in the pit of his stomach as he surveyed the area. This was where everything would either come together or fall apart. The warehouse they were targeting was just ahead, a dilapidated structure surrounded by other abandoned buildings. It looked inconspicuous, but Hawk knew better. This place was a front for something far more sinister. As they parked their bikes, Hawk's crew gathered around, each one checking their gear and making sure they were ready. They had come a long way since that first night when Maya had run to them for help, and now it was time to finish what they had started. Hawk looked at each of his men, his gaze lingering for a moment on Phantom, who was scanning the building with a look of concentration. Ready? Hawk asked, his voice steady. Phantom gave a quick nod. We're in position. We'll keep an eye on the back. No one's getting out without us seeing them. Good, Hawk said, turning his attention to the rest of the crew. We go in quiet, we get what we need, and we get out. No unnecessary risks. Bear, who had been quiet until then, spoke up. You think they're going to be expecting us? Hawk glanced at him, his expression grim. They've got their eyes on us by now, but we're going to make sure they don't know what hit them. With that, they moved out, slipping into the shadows of the nearby alleyways. Hawk's heart was pounding as they approached the warehouse. The closer they got, the more he could feel the gravity of the situation. This wasn't just about taking down a criminal or two. This was about exposing a system of corruption that had been hidden in plain sight for far too long. As they reached the entrance of the warehouse, Hawk motioned for everyone to stop. The door was slightly ajar, just enough to let the light from inside spill out into the darkened alley. Hawk's hand rested on the cold metal of the door for a moment before he pushed it open, his eyes scanning the interior. The warehouse was mostly empty, save for a few crates and stacks of old equipment. The men they had been tracking were in the far corner, speaking in hushed tones. Hawk could hear snippets of their conversation as they carefully moved into position. We need to move everything out by tonight, one of the men said. If we don't, we'll lose everything. Hawk's stomach churned. They were talking about their operation, the one that had been threatening not just Maya's family, but countless others. What about Donovan? Another voice asked. Hawk's breath caught in his throat. They were still talking about him, the man who had been at the center of this entire mess. He's been compromised, the first voice said, his tone low. We'll have to take care of it. We can't afford any loose ends. Hawk's jaw tightened. He knew what that meant. They weren't just dealing with a few bad apples. They were dealing with a group that would do anything to protect themselves. Hawk motioned for his crew to move in, and they slipped into the shadows, closing the distance between themselves and the criminals. As they got closer, Hawk could hear their voices growing louder. I told you we can't afford mistakes, one of the men said. We'll handle it. Just make sure the others don't get too comfortable. Hawk could feel the heat rising in his chest. These men had ruined so many lives, and now they were trying to cover their tracks. He couldn't let them get away with it. On my signal, Hawk whispered to the crew. We move fast. They waited for the perfect moment, the air thick with anticipation. When the time was right, Hawk gave the signal, and the crew rushed forward, quickly and quietly. The element of surprise was on their side. They moved in fast, catching the men off guard. The first two men didn't have time to react before Bear and Colossus were on them, securing their arms and forcing them to the ground. Hawk moved swiftly to the next group of men, his eyes fixed on the leader, the one who had been speaking about Donovan. You're not going anywhere, Hawk said, his voice low and dangerous. The man turned, eyes wide with surprise. What? How did you? But before he could finish, Hawk grabbed him by the collar and slammed him against the wall. You've been running this operation for too long, Hawk growled. And it ends tonight. The man struggled, but Hawk wasn't letting him go. Where's Donovan? Hawk demanded. The man's eyes flickered, and for a moment, Hawk thought he was going to stay silent. But then he spoke. He's gone, he spat. We already cut ties. He's no longer part of this. Hawk's mind raced. If Donovan was gone, that meant the network was even bigger than he had realized. You're lying, Hawk said, his voice cold. I don't believe you. The man's face twisted in anger. You think you can stop this? We've got people everywhere. You can't touch us. Hawk stepped closer, his hand tightening around the man's collar. I don't care who you've got. This ends tonight. You're going to tell me everything, or I'll make you wish you had. The man's eyes darted to the others, who were still being restrained by the crew. He swallowed hard, his defiance fading as the pressure mounted. All right, he said, his voice shaking. I'll talk. Hawk's grip loosened slightly, but he didn't let the man go. Start talking. The man took a deep breath. There's a bigger organization behind all this. People who want to keep everything under wraps. And Donovan, he's just a pawn. But the real players? They're in high places. People who are untouchable. You'll never get to them. Hawk felt a chill run down his spine. The deeper this went, the more dangerous it became. But there was no turning back now. He wasn't just going to expose a few criminals. He was going after the heart of the operation. We'll see about that, Hawk said, his voice steady. The fight wasn't over. In fact, it had just begun. The man's admission struck Hawk like a fist to the gut. He had suspected there were more people involved, but hearing it confirmed, hearing the scale of what they were up against, made the weight of their mission even heavier. There were more layers to peel back, and with every answer, the picture of a network that ran deeper and more insidiously through the fabric of society became clearer. Hawk knew they had to act fast. Who are these people? Hawk's voice was low but demanding, his grip on the man tightening. The man gasped for breath but refused to meet his eyes, looking down at the floor, like he was contemplating how much to reveal. I'm not talking, he spat out, his defiance flaring up again. You can't stop them. Hawk stepped closer, not giving an inch. I'll make sure you regret that choice if you don't start talking. Your friends won't save you. The man winced, his resolve faltering under Hawk's intense stare. All right, he muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. There's a network. It's not just in law enforcement. There are businessmen, politicians. They control everything. The money, the power, the deals. They're untouchable. Hawk could feel his heart race as he processed the new information. Where do they meet? He asked, his voice icy. The man hesitated for a moment, but then his eyes shifted to the corner of the warehouse. There's a facility upstate. It's a warehouse, same as this one, but bigger. That's where the real meetings happen. They've been planning something big. Something that could change everything. Hawk's mind was already spinning, calculating the next move. He knew they needed to get to that warehouse, but it wouldn't be easy. The people they were dealing with had power, real power. And if they didn't act soon, this operation could slip out of their hands. How do we get in? Hawk asked. The man looked up, his face showing the smallest glimmer of fear. You don't. Not without making them notice you. You'll have to go through someone on the inside. Hawk stood still for a moment, thinking. Who? He asked. There's a contact. I can get you their name. But it's dangerous. If you're not careful, you'll be walking into a trap. Hawk didn't hesitate. Give me the name, he demanded. The man hesitated again, but then finally muttered the name of a business contact, someone high up in the ranks of the network. Hawk knew this wasn't going to be easy, but they couldn't waste any more time. The information the man had provided would be crucial to bringing down the entire operation. With a final shove, Hawk stepped back. You're done here. You're going to stay quiet, and when the authorities come, you're going to tell them everything you've just told me. If not, Hawk let the threat hang in the air, knowing full well the man had no choice but to comply. The crew quickly secured the area, ensuring no one else was around. As Hawk turned to leave, he caught a glimpse of Phantom, who had been quietly monitoring the rest of the scene. I've got what I need, Phantom said, his voice low but clear. Let's move before they realize what's going on. Hawk nodded. All right, we've got a lead. Let's get to work. As the crew moved out of the warehouse, Hawk's thoughts raced. They were running out of time, and every minute they delayed gave the people behind this network a chance to cover their tracks. The next move had to be perfect. They needed to get to that warehouse upstate. But with what they had just learned, it was clear that this was no longer just about exposing the criminals. They were up against a well-connected, organized force. It wasn't just about saving Maya and her sister anymore. It was about taking down an entire criminal enterprise that had infiltrated the core of society. As Hawk and his crew mounted their bikes, ready to head out, he felt the familiar rush of adrenaline pumping through his veins. This was the moment they had been working toward. But as much as they had planned, Hawk knew it wouldn't be easy. They were up against something much bigger than they could have imagined. Still, he wasn't about to back down now. He had made a promise to protect those who couldn't protect themselves. And no matter how deep this went, no matter what it cost him, Hawk was going to see it through. The crew set off toward the next stage of their mission, their bikes roaring to life as they sped down the road. The storm was coming, and Hawk was ready to face it head-on. As Hawk and his crew approached the warehouse upstate, the final pieces of the puzzle were starting to fall into place. The tension in the air was palpable, thick with anticipation. They had uncovered the network's deepest secrets, and now they were about to face the people who had built it all. The last of the bikers rolled up to the entrance, engines cutting off one by one, leaving the eerie silence of the night. Hawk turned to his crew, his expression as determined as ever. "This is it," he said, his voice steady. "We go in, we shut them down, and we make sure they don't hurt anyone else." Bear nodded, his face grim. "We've come this far. We finish it here." Phantom scanned the area, eyes sharp. "This place is too quiet. No signs of movement. But that doesn't mean they're not waiting for us." Hawk looked around, his instincts on high alert. "We stay quiet, stay fast. We need to hit them before they can react." The crew spread out, moving like shadows through the tall grass and overgrown pathways that led to the back of the warehouse. Hawk's heart was pounding, but his focus never wavered. They had been through a lot together, and now it was time to finish what they had started. As they crept closer to the building, Hawk saw the faint glow of lights from the windows. Inside, the men responsible for all the chaos, the pain, and the manipulation were gathered. They thought they had control, thought they had everything in place. But Hawk and his crew were about to change that. They approached the side door, the most vulnerable entry point, and waited for the signal. Hawk held up his hand, motioning for everyone to freeze. A few seconds later, the door creaked open just enough for them to slip inside. The room was dark, but Hawk's eyes quickly adjusted. He could see the figures of several men huddled around a table, their voices low, discussing plans, moving pieces on a map. "We've got to get this done tonight," one man said. "The cops are already getting too close. If we don't move now, we'll lose everything." Hawk moved forward, his crew following suit. They were so close now, they could practically feel the danger radiating off the walls. "They're planning something big," Phantom whispered, his voice barely audible. "We have to stop it." Hawk gave a subtle nod. This was the final stand. The moment when everything they had worked for would either succeed or fail. As they entered the room, the men turned, their eyes widening in shock. They had expected a confrontation, but not like this. "Who the hell are you?" one man shouted, reaching for his weapon. But before he could even pull it out, Bear was on him, knocking the gun from his hand and forcing him to the ground. The rest of the bikers moved swiftly, taking control of the room in seconds. "No one's going anywhere," Hawk said, his voice cold and commanding. "You're done." The man who had been leading the operation, one of the higher-ups in the network, stared at Hawk with fear in his eyes. "You don't know who you're dealing with," he spat. "You can't stop us. We're everywhere. The money, the power, the connections, you'll never bring it down." Hawk stepped forward, his gaze unwavering. "I don't care how big you think you are. You hurt the wrong people. And now it's over." The man's face twisted in anger, but there was a flicker of fear behind his eyes. "You'll regret this," he said. "We'll come for you. You won't get away with it." Hawk didn't flinch. "You're already done. This ends tonight." The sound of sirens filled the air, but Hawk wasn't worried. He had made sure everything was in place. The authorities would take care of the rest. As the men were secured and the warehouse was cleared, Hawk turned to his crew. "We did it," he said, his voice low but full of pride. "This is over." But even as the words left his mouth, he knew the fight wasn't truly over. The network they had just taken down was just a piece of a much larger operation. They had made their mark, but Hawk wasn't naive enough to think that would be the end of it. There would be more work to do, more people to bring down, more corruption to expose. He thought about Aisha and the girls, about how their lives would finally begin to heal after everything they had endured. He had kept his promise to Tyrone. Maya and her sister were safe now. But Hawk knew that peace would be fleeting. As long as there were people willing to exploit others for their own gain, the fight would never truly be over. Hawk mounted his bike, the engine roaring to life beneath him. His crew followed suit, their bikes echoing through the quiet streets. The road ahead was uncertain, but one thing was clear: Hawk wasn't going to stop. Not now. Not ever. Together, they had brought down a powerful criminal network. But Hawk knew it was just the beginning of a much larger fight for justice. They had won this battle, but there would be more to come, and they would be ready. With that, Hawk sped off into the night, his crew following close behind. They had won, but they weren't done yet.